The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford, Section 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford, Section 13. Fourth Book, Part 2. In spite of all my willingness, I did not get at the matter without difficulty, for my teacher could not suppress certain sarcastic remarks as to the real truth about Hebrew. I concealed from him my designs upon Jew-German, and spoke of a better understanding of the original text. He smiled at this, and said I should be satisfied if I only learned to read. This vexed me in secret, and I concentrated all my attention when we came to the letters. I found an alphabet something like the Greek, of which the forms were easy and the names for the most part not strange to me. All this I had soon comprehended and retained, and supposed we should now take up reading. That this was done from right to left I was well aware, but now all at once appeared a new army of little characters and signs, of points and strokes of all sorts, which were in fact to represent vowels. At this I wondered the more, as there were manifestly vowels in the larger alphabet, and the others only appeared to be hidden under strange appellations. I was also taught that the Jewish nation, as long as it flourished, actually was satisfied with the former signs, and knew no other way of writing and reading. Most willingly, then, would I have gone along this ancient, and it seemed to me easier path, but my worthy declared rather sternly that we must go by the grammar as it had been approved and composed. Reading without these points and strokes, he said, was a very hard undertaking, and could be accomplished only by the learned and those who were well practised. I must, therefore, make up my mind to learn these little characters. But the matter became to me more and more confused. Now it seemed some of the first and larger primitive letters had no value in their places, in order that their little afterborn kindred might not stand there in vain. Now they indicated a gentle breathing, now a guttural more or less rough, and now served as mere equivalents. But finally, when one fancied that he had well noted everything, some of these personages, both great and small, were rendered inoperative, so that the eyes always had very much, and the lips very little to do. As that of which I already knew the contents had now to be stuttered in a strange gibberish, in which a certain snuffle and gargle were not a little commended as something unattainable, I in a certain degree deviated from the matter, and diverted myself in a childish way with the singular names of these accumulated signs. There were emperors, kings, and dukes. Footnote: these are the technical names for classes of accents in the Hebrew grammar, translator, which, as accents governing here and there, gave me not a little entertainment. But even these shallow jests soon lost their charm. Nevertheless, I was indemnified, inasmuch as by reading, translating, repeating, and committing to memory, the substance of the book came out more vividly, and it was this, properly, about which I desired to be enlightened. Even before this time, the contradiction between tradition and the actual and possible had appeared to me very striking, and I had often put my private tutors to a nonplus with the sun which stood still on Gibeon, and the moon in the vale of Ajalon, to say nothing of other improbabilities and incongruities. Everything of this kind was now awakened, while, in order to master the Hebrew, I occupied myself exclusively with the Old Testament and studied it, though no longer in Luther's translation, but in the literal version of Sebastian Schmidt, printed under the text, which my father had procured for me. Here, I am sorry to say, our lessons began to be defective in regard to practice in the language. Reading, interpreting, grammar, transcribing, and the repetition of words seldom lasted a full half hour, for I immediately began to aim at the sense of the matter. And though we were still engaged in the first book of Moses, to utter several things suggested to me by the later books. At first the good old man tried to restrain me from such digressions, but at last they seemed to entertain him also. It was impossible for him to suppress his characteristic cough and chuckle, and although he carefully avoided giving me any information that might have compromised himself, my importunity was not relaxed. Nay, as I cared more to set forth my doubts than to learn their solution, I grew constantly more vivacious and bold, seeming justified by his deportment. Yet I could get nothing out of him, except that ever and anon he would exclaim with his peculiar shaking laugh, "Ah, mad fellow! Mad boy!" Still, my childish vivacity, which scrutinized the Bible on all sides, may have seemed to him tolerably serious and worthy of some assistance. He therefore referred me after a time to the large English biblical work which stood in his library, and in which the interpretation of difficult and doubtful passages was attempted in an intelligent and judicious manner. By the great labours of German divines, the translation had obtained advantages over the original. The different opinions were cited, and at last a kind of reconciliation was attempted, so that the dignity of the book, the ground of religion, and the human understanding might in some degree coexist. Now, as often as towards the end of the lesson I came out with my usual questions and doubts, so often did he point to the repository. I took the volume, he let me read, turned over his Lucian, and when I made any remarks on the book, his ordinary laugh was the only answer to my sagacity. In the long summer days he let me sit as long as I could read, many times alone. After a time he suffered me to take one volume after another home with me. Man may turn which way he please, and undertake anything whatsoever, he will always return to the path which nature has once prescribed for him. Thus it happened also with me in the present case. The trouble I took with the language, with the contents of the sacred scriptures themselves, ended at last in producing in my imagination a livelier picture of that beautiful and famous land, its environs and vicinities, as well as of the people and events by which that little spot of earth was made glorious for thousands of years. This small space was to see the origin and growth of the human race. Thence we were to derive our first and only accounts of primitive history, and such a locality was to lie before our imagination, no less simple and comprehensible and varied, and adapted to the most wonderful migrations and settlements. Here, between four designated rivers, a small delightful spot was separated from the whole habitable earth for youthful man. Here he was to unfold his first capacities, and here at the same time was the lot to befall him which was appointed for all his posterity, namely, that of losing peace by striving after knowledge. Paradise was trifled away, men increased and grew worse, and the Elohim, not yet accustomed to the wickedness of the new race, became impatient and utterly destroyed it. Only a few were saved from the universal deluge, and scarcely had this dreadful flood ceased than the well-known ancestral soil lay once more before the grateful eyes of the preserved. 2 rivers out of 4, the Euphrates and the Tigris, still flowed in their beds. The name of the first remained, the other seemed to be pointed out by its course. Minuter traces of paradise were not to be looked for after so great a revolution. The renewed race of man went forth hence a second time. It found occasion to sustain and employ itself in all sorts of ways, but chiefly to gather around it large herds of tame animals, and to wander with them in every direction. This mode of life, as well as the increase of the families, soon compelled the people to disperse. They could not at once resolve to let their relatives and friends go forever. They hit upon the thought of building a lofty tower, which should show them the way back from the far distance. But this attempt, like their first endeavour, miscarried. They could not be at the same time happy and wise, numerous and united. The Elohim confounded their minds. The building remained unfinished, the men were dispersed. The world was peopled, but sundered. But our regards, our interest, continue fixed on these regions. At last the founder of a race again goes forth from hence, and is so fortunate as to stamp a distinct character upon his descendants, and by that means to unite them for all time to come into a great nation, inseparable through all changes of place and destiny. From the Euphrates, Abraham, not without divine guidance, wanders towards the west. The desert opposes no invincible barrier to his march. He attains the Jordan, passes over its waters, and spreads himself over the fair southern regions of Palestine. This land was already occupied and tolerably well inhabited. Mountains, not extremely high, but rocky and barren, were severed by many watered vales favourable to cultivation. Towns, villages, and solitary settlements lay scattered over the plain and on the slopes of the great valley, the waters of which are collected in Jordan. Thus inhabited, thus tilled was the land. But the world was still large enough, and the men were not so circumspect, necessitous, and active as to usurp at once the whole adjacent country. Between their possessions were extended large spaces in which grazing herds could freely move in every direction. In one of these spaces Abraham resides. His brother Lot is near him. But they cannot long remain in such places. The very condition of a land, the population of which is now increasing, now decreasing, and the productions of which are never kept in equilibrium with the wants, produces unexpectedly a famine, and the stranger suffers alike with the native, whose own support he has rendered difficult by his accidental presence. The 2 Chaldean brothers move onward to Egypt, and thus is traced out for us the theatre on which for some thousands of years the most important events of the world were to be enacted. From the Tigris to the Euphrates, from the Euphrates to the Nile, we see the earth peopled, and this space also is traversed by a well-known, heaven-beloved man who has already become worthy to us, moving to and fro with his goods and cattle, and in a short time abundantly increasing them. The brothers return, but taught by the distress they have endured, they determine to part. Both indeed tarry in southern Canaan, but while Abraham remains at Hebron, near the wood of Mamre, Lot departs for the valley of Siddim, which, if our imagination is bold enough to give Jordan a subterranean outlet, so that in place of the present Dead Sea we should have dry ground, can and must appear like a second paradise, a conjecture all the more probable because the residents about there, notorious for effeminacy and wickedness, lead us to infer that they led an easy and luxurious life. Lot lives among them, but apart. But Hebron and the wood of Mamre appear to us as the important place, where the Lord speaks with Abraham, and promises him all the land as far as his eye can reach in 4 directions. From these quiet districts, from these shepherd tribes who can associate with celestials, entertain them as guests, and hold many conversations with them, we are compelled to turn our glance once more towards the east, and to think of the condition of the surrounding world, which on the whole perhaps may have been like that of Canaan. Families hold together, they unite, and the mode of life of the tribes is determined by the locality which they have appropriated or appropriate. On the mountains which send down their waters to the Tigris we find warlike populations, who even thus early foreshadow those world conquerors and world rulers, and in a campaign prodigious for those times give us a prelude of future achievements. Chedor-laomer, king of Elam, has already a mighty influence over his allies. He reigns a long while. For 12 years before Abraham's arrival in Canaan, he had made all the people tributary to him as far as the Jordan. They revolted at last, and the allies equipped for war. We find them unawares upon a route by which probably Abraham also reached Canaan. The people on the left and lower side of the Jordan were subdued. Chedor-laomer directs his march southwards towards the people of the desert. Then, wending north, he smites the Amalekites, and when he has also overcome the Amorites, he reaches Canaan, falls upon the kings of the valley of Siddim, smites and scatters them, and marches with great spoil up the Jordan, in order to extend his conquests as far as Lebanon. Among the captives, despoiled and dragged along with their property, is Lot, who shares the fate of the country in which he lives a guest. Abraham learns this, and here at once we behold the patriarch, a warrior and hero. He hurriedly gathers his servants, divides them into troops, attacks and falls upon the luggage of booty, confuses the victors, who could not suspect another enemy in the rear, and brings back his brother and his goods, with a great deal more belonging to the conquered kings. Abraham, by means of this brief contest, acquires, as it were, the whole land. To the inhabitants he appears as a protector, saviour, and, by his disinterestedness, a king. Gratefully the kings of the valley receive him, Melchizedek, the king and priest, with blessings. Now the prophecies of an endless posterity are renewed, nay, they take a wider and wider scope. From the waters of the Euphrates to the river of Egypt, all the lands are promised him. But yet there seems a difficulty with respect to his next heirs. He is 80 years of age and has no son. Sarai, less trusting in the heavenly powers than he, becomes impatient. She desires, after the Oriental fashion, to have a descendant by means of her maid. But no sooner is Hagar given up to the master of the house, no sooner is there hope of a son, than dissensions arise. The wife treats her own dependent ill enough, and Hagar flies to seek a happier position among other tribes. She returns, not without a higher intimation, and Ishmael is born. Abraham is now 99 years old, and the promises of a numerous posterity are constantly repeated, so that in the end the pair regard them as ridiculous. And yet Sarai becomes at last pregnant, and brings forth a son to whom the name of Isaac is given. History, for the most part, rests upon the legitimate propagation of the human race. The most important events of the world require to be traced to the secrets of families, and thus the marriages of the patriarchs give occasion for peculiar considerations. It is as if the divinity, who loves to guide the destiny of mankind, wished to prefigure here connubial events of every kind. Abraham, so long united by childless marriage to a beautiful woman whom many coveted, finds himself in his 100th year the husband of 2 women, the father of 2 sons. And at this moment his domestic peace is broken. 2 women and 2 sons by different mothers cannot possibly agree. The party less favoured by law, usage, and opinion must yield. Abraham must sacrifice his attachment to Hagar and Ishmael. Both are dismissed, and Hagar is compelled now against her will to go upon a road which she once took in voluntary flight. At first it seems to the destruction of herself and child, but the angel of the Lord, who had before sent her back, now rescues her again, that Ishmael also may become a great people, and that the most improbable of all promises may be fulfilled beyond its limits. 2 parents in advanced years and 1 son of their old age. Here at last one might expect domestic quiet and earthly happiness. By no means. Heaven is yet preparing the heaviest trial for the patriarch. But of this we cannot speak without premising several considerations. If a natural universal religion was to arise, and a special revealed one to be developed from it, the countries in which our imagination has hitherto lingered, the mode of life, the race of men, were the fittest for the purpose. At least we do not find in the whole world anything equally favourable and encouraging. Even to natural religion, if we assume that it arose earlier in the human mind, there pertains much of the delicacy of sentiment, for it rests upon the conviction of an universal providence which conducts the order of the world as a whole. A particular religion, revealed by heaven to this or that people, carries with it the belief in a special providence, which the divine being vouchsafes to certain favoured men, families, races, and people. This faith seems to develop itself with difficulty from man's inward nature. It requires tradition, usage, and the warrant of a primitive time. Beautiful is it, therefore, that the Israelitish tradition represents the very first men who confide in this particular providence as heroes of faith, following all the commands of that high being on whom they acknowledge themselves dependent, just as blindly as, undisturbed by doubts, they are unwearied in awaiting the later fulfilments of his promises. As the particular revealed religion rests upon the idea that one man may be more favoured by heaven than another, so it also arises preeminently from the separation of classes. The first men appeared closely allied, but their employments soon divided them. The hunter was the freest of all. From him was developed the warrior and the ruler. Those who tilled the field bound themselves to the soil, erected dwellings and barns to preserve what they had gained, and could estimate themselves pretty highly, because their condition promised durability and security. The herdsman in his position seemed to have acquired the most unbounded condition and unlimited property. The increase of herds proceeded without end, and the space which was to support them widened itself on all sides. These three classes seemed from the very first to have regarded each other with dislike and contempt, and as the herdsman was an abomination to the townsman, so did he in turn separate from the other. The hunters vanish from our sight among the hills and reappear only as conquerors. The patriarchs belong to the shepherd class. Their manner of life upon the ocean of deserts and pastures gave breadth and freedom to their minds. The vault of heaven under which they dwelt, with all its nightly stars, elevated their feelings, and they, more than the active, skilful huntsman or the secure, careful, householding husbandman, had need of the immovable faith that a God walked beside them, visited them, cared for them, guided and saved them. We are compelled to make another reflection in passing to the rest of the history. Humane, beautiful, and cheering as the religion of the patriarchs appears, yet traits of savageness and cruelty run through it, out of which man may emerge, or into which he may again be sunk. That hatred should seek to appease itself by the blood, by the death of the conquered enemy, is natural. That men concluded a peace upon the battlefield among the ranks of the slain may easily be conceived. That they should in like manner think to give validity to a contract by slain animals follows from the preceding. The notion also that slain creatures could attract, propitiate, and gain over the gods, whom they always looked upon as partisans, either opponents or allies, is likewise not at all surprising. But if we confine our attention to the sacrifices, and consider the way in which they were offered in that primitive time, we find a singular and to our notions altogether repugnant custom, probably derived from the usages of war, namely, that the sacrificed animals of every kind, and whatever number was devoted, had to be hewn in two halves, and laid out on two sides, so that in the space between them were those who wished to make a covenant with the deity. End of section 13.